Hey guys, this ought to be your first recorded lecture that you're watching or listening to. And so I know hopefully that we've already discussed what things are going to be like in this online format for the next few weeks in our in discussion conversation, which at least theoretically you've already taken part of if I post this on Monday, unless you're like a really early get up and go getter. But I do want to talk about it here just so that you have a reminder or a refresher of how things are going to work. So, just to walk you through it, on Google Classroom, there is going to be a post that is going to be your hub for the week. It's going to have links to all of the videos, it's going to have links to all of the quizzes or anything else that's going to be going on that week. It also has some supplementary materials, some YouTube videos that you can watch if you want more information, some just things that I think are interesting that you ought to see. And so just be aware of that. And remember that you can complete any of that work over the next week. Everything's due Friday. That gives me time to look through and grade and make sure everything's good to go by next Monday. And we'll start over again on next Monday. So this is very free form. You could get everything done Monday. And then all you would have to do, as far as my class is concerned, is you would have to come to an in-class discussion on Tuesday. And of course, the times for that are posted as well. And you'll see those up in a separate post because if this situation continues past 2 weeks, then we will continue on the same schedule. So best to put that separately. You'll also notice that I'm putting a syllabus for each week because with us all being spread out, I just don't want there to be any confusion. And I will try and keep RunWeb updated correctly as well. So we will have a syllabus each week. It should, as much as possible, mirror the original one. So if you're keeping up with the original syllabus, there shouldn't be anything surprising there. But just in case you need a refresher, there should be a new syllabus up every week. So just be aware of that and keep that in mind. Okay, with all of that being said, let's dive into our lecture for today, our conversation. And just as a reminder again, that at the end of this lecture, you ought to open up the lecture worksheet and answer a couple questions. These will be short, mostly just double checking that you were in fact listening and were in fact paying attention to what was going on. I will also, if possible, post the slides, although those might end up in a separate post. Probably will not all be together in that hub post, but those should be available as well, just because otherwise the hub post is going to be so long that it's unusable. So if you want to see the slides, if you want the notes for studying for the test, be aware of that. Also, I plan to talk about this in the in-class discussion, but again, just as a refresher, I am planning to move the history test. After looking at the syllabus, it was originally scheduled for the last Friday that we would be gone. I'm moving it in case we have school the following week. I'd rather have the class in person. If not, we will take it on our Chromebooks. It won't be a big deal, but just be aware of that. You might have to take a test in this format if school continues to be out. Who knows? We'll all have to be flexible as far as it comes to that. All right, let's talk about American entry into World War One. We have been talking about why World War One started. We've been talking about the American home front a little bit, but now we're going to dive into American entry into World War One. Then we will talk about what was going on in World War One tomorrow, or the next lecture, rather, I should say, as in what's going on in the war without the American involvement. And then finally, we'll talk about America's change to the war. And then we'll talk about the American home front and a few other things that I think are particularly important. But let's talk about American entry into World War One. Much like World War II, a lot of people think they know why the United States entered the war. But I'm here to tell you that World War One is more complicated, especially when it comes to the American involvement in World War One. There is no cut and dried moment like in World War II with December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, that the United States was gung-ho into the war. Okay, some people think it's the sinking of the Lusitania, which it wasn't. In fact, the sinking of the Lusitania, which we'll talk about, occurred 2 years before American entry into the war. So that wasn't clearly the event that brought us into the war. Some people think that it was the Zimmermann telegram, which was a telegram between Germany and Mexico, trying to get Mexico to in some way join the war. It wasn't even that, although both of those things contributed. It wasn't some military disaster in Belgium. It wasn't some military disaster for the Russians. There's all these ideas that get thrown around here. This is why the United States joined the war. And really, none of them are the one reason. In fact, they are all part of the reason, but I don't think any of them are the one reason. I don't think there is one reason for American entry into World War I. But let's go back to the beginning of the war from an American perspective. And we're going to be looking today in this lecture from an American perspective because there's lots of stuff going on in the war. And if we dive deep into that stuff, it gets really, really complex. And unfortunately, we just don't have time to do that. So let's look at it from an American perspective. In 1914, the war begins. It begins in August, although the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which is what starts the entire thing, occurred back in June. So approximately 1 month after the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, we have war break out in Europe, okay? And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about the European side of things, but that's what's going on. Now, the important thing to know about why the war went from a Austrian, Russian, German kerfuffle into a French, British, and later American thing is the plan of the German High Command. The German High Command, after having defeated France in the last war and seeing an alliance created between France and Russia, if we think about where France and Russia are on the map compared to Germany, we know that they're on either side. And Germany realized, just like many nations, that fighting a two-front war, a war where you have to fight one enemy on one side and another enemy on another side, is really, really difficult. And so the Germans created a plan to knock out one of the two powers. And if you know any military history at all, if you know anything about World War II or Napoleon's campaigns, knocking Russia out quickly, not really a real opportunity, not really a real possibility for the Germans. So the Germans think that let's knock France out quickly. The problem is that France, after the last war, realized that their border with Germany was weak, and so they had reinforced it. And a vast majority of their army and their fortress defenses were on the border between Germany and France, because Germany and France touch. And so that wasn't really an option. The Germans could not get through there quickly. And the entire point of the plan, it was called the Schlieffen Plan, was to get to Paris as quick as possible, knock the French out of the war, then rotate the entire German war effort to fight with Russia. Because Russia is so big, it takes time for them to mobilize. So maybe we can knock France unconscious first, and then we can come back and we can defeat the Russians. That's the general plan. There's more nuance to it, but that's what we need to know. The problem, as I mentioned, is that the border with France is not very easy to get through. Maybe it could be gotten through, but it'd be difficult. Instead, Germany looks at a much weaker border, and that was the border between Germany and Belgium. We've talked about Belgium before. Belgium was a country that was basically created by the British in 1848, kind of broken off from the Netherlands and France, which had both variously controlled it at different times. It was kind of created as a neutral nation that was basically meant to keep the peace between France and Germany, because if anybody invaded it, basically Great Britain would attack the other guy. And so Germany looked at Belgium and saw weak borders and realized that they could sweep across Belgium, and then they could come down into France. This is exactly what they did. Unfortunately, by doing so, they led Great Britain to declare war on them. So effectively, they dragged another power into the war, and obviously that would eventually lead to German defeat. So Germany was really in a tough situation if they wanted to enact their plan. They could try and punch through the French defenses, probably not going to happen, or they could go through weak Belgium or the weak defenses in Belgium, but that would undoubtedly bring the United Kingdom into the war. Now, how does that all apply to Americans? So this is from the American perspective. Well, almost immediately, there were stories coming out of Belgium of atrocities or things that were happening. The Germans were basically leaving behind normal rules, and they were just being barbarians. In fact, England almost immediately began to use a propaganda campaign to claim that the Germans were horrendously treating the Belgians. Sometimes this was called the rape of Belgium, which obviously has very negative connotations. The Germans were described as the Huns, which in this case, I think it would be best to think of the movie Mulan if you've ever seen it, right? The Huns are these big, nasty, tough barbarians that come out of the north and they burn all the villages of China down. Of course, by the way, all of that is a misconception. The Huns, while they were an Asian steppe nomadic group, they actually ended up in Europe and fought the Roman Empire, but we'll let Mulan do its thing. But the English kept calling the Germans the Huns. The Huns are here, right? And you get this picture in your head of these German soldiers just entering Belgium, lighting things on fire, dragging women and children out of their houses and like shooting them or something. It's just really this very negative connotation that it had. And the question is, of course, is there any truth to that? And the answer to that is no. Belgium was destroyed in the fighting, which is unfortunate, and I think the Germans are responsible for that. But there was not a wide-scale atrocities. There were a few executions that were probably unlawful, but certainly nothing on the scale that the English were claiming there was. They claimed that Germany was killing and torturing Belgium civilians and all of this stuff. And the propaganda of this time is really quite interesting. It shows like chains being thrown on people and burning towns and all of this stuff. And Americans were definitely amazed by this and believed it. And that's the key. It's kind of like the modern media. The key is not whether it's true. The key is, are the people that are listening to you believing you? And maybe we've seen that with the coronavirus, or maybe the coronavirus is worse than it actually has been recorded, or vice versa. Maybe it's not as bad. But the key is the media is convincing us it's one way or the other. That's kind of what's going on here. The British were misleading the Americans a little bit. Now, at the end of the day, obviously, I think Germany was in the wrong in invading Belgium. So I think that Britain had a point, but they definitely were exaggerating things going on. So this is the first step. That being said, very few Americans were upset enough to say, let's go jump in the war. Some Americans said, well, let's stop trading with Germany. By the way, that wasn't an option anyway. Britain had closed off trade from Germany to the United States already. Basically, the Royal Navy said, if you're trying to ship goods to Germany, we're going to intercept them. You can't. So these people in the United States saying, hey, let's not sell to Germany. I mean, they already weren't selling to Germany. They couldn't. So that's a little silly. All that being said, a majority of Americans said, maybe, maybe not. There's some counter press in the United States, especially from German areas of the United States, that said, wait a second, we're getting reports and there's nothing like what the British are saying. So there gets to be a little bit of a media war going on. One side saying one thing, the other side saying the other thing. Now, the United States kind of goes back to sleep, waiting and watching to see the events that are going to take place in Europe. We have a failure of the Germans to punch through Belgium. They actually get stopped in northern France, and that develops into trench warfare. We'll talk about that extensively tomorrow. Don't worry. Surprisingly, despite the fact that Germany was not able to complete its plan to knock France out of the war early, it actually enjoyed enormous success against the Russians. And in the East, Germany actually didn't have to worry nearly as much as it thought it did. It was severely outnumbered, but the Russians simply had an incompetent army compared to the Germans and were defeated on several occasions. In addition to this, the Ottoman Empire joined the war, joined the Central Powers, which now included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, versus Russia, Great Britain, and France. And so there's really a lot of impact and fighting in a lot of different places. I think it earned the moniker of World War, the Great War, as it was called at the time, very well. The next event from an American perspective that's going to change American opinions on the war is the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania is a really interesting event. First off, it ought to be pointed out that the Lusitania was a British ship. It was not an American ship. And it was a passenger liner, okay? And what happened is it was sunk by a German submarine. Now, let's unpack this because it sounds pretty bad in Germany's behalf, but why didn't the United States go to war immediately if Germany's just blowing up people in the middle of the ocean? Well, there's a lot more complexity here. Number one, Britain had declared Germany was off limits to everyone. Their navy would enforce a total blockade of German waters. You could not ship anything to Germany. You couldn't really travel to Germany by boat without British permission. The Germans declared a counter blockade of Great Britain, but the problem is the British Navy was still the most powerful fleet on the planet. The Germans were powerful, but not powerful enough to defeat them. But the Germans had a new piece of technology that had really never been used widely before, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. The Germans are very famous for using this technology, and that is the U-boat, or the Unterseeboot, or as we would call it in English, the submarine. Now, a submarine is a very interesting piece of technology because it's almost the exact opposite philosophy of the big surface warships that were the main parts of fleets in World War I. A big battleship has huge guns that can fire tens of miles. It has massive, foot-thick armor plating to absorb the impact of other guns. They're basically floating fortresses that can move. I mean, they can move as fast as 20 to 30 miles per hour, so they're not slow by any means. But they're basically big, moving fortresses with several thousand soldiers on them. The purpose is to get in there and really just clobber each other, and whoever's left standing wins. That's kind of the design philosophy of the battleships. The submarines are almost exactly the opposite. A submarine, by its very nature, has almost no armor. I mean, think about it. If you put a hole in a submarine, it sinks. I mean, there's not much to it. If it can get to the surface in time, maybe it'll survive. If you close your bulkheads down, which we talked about in class a few weeks ago, maybe you survive. But there's not much of a chance. So if you get hit, that's pretty much it. Now, something that you might not realize is that water is actually a fantastic way to avoid bullets. In fact, if you are curious, look up a YouTube video of somebody firing a gun underwater. It doesn't work. Bullets stop moving after about 6 feet with a regular handgun, and even larger guns, they don't go much further. So submarines, while they don't have any armor on them, because they operate under the water most of the time, they are protected. But more importantly, they're protected by secrecy. So we have the battleships, which are big, they're strong, they're tough, but everybody can see them coming. And we have the submarines, which you really can't see coming. The submarines also utilize a new technology that the word actually changed meanings, and that's the word torpedo. Back in the Civil War, torpedoes had meant what we think of as mines. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, and you remember when Bruce and Dory and Marlin are swimming to the submarine, there's those big spiky things on chains. Those are mines. But they used to be called torpedoes back in the Civil War. Now torpedoes are these long tube structures. They can be anywhere from 6 to 12 feet long with their own propellers on them. And you can fire them out of tubes in a submarine or a warship. And these things go under the water. And the purpose is to connect with an enemy ship and explode. By doing that, where does the hole end up? Well, that's exactly right. It ends up underneath the waterline. You just put a hole in the bottom of the boat. Now, again, as we've talked about in class, bulkheads, which are these compartments in the ship that can be locked down, might enable you to survive a hit from a torpedo. Maybe. But you're certainly going to survive it a lot less than getting hit on the top of your ship. A hole on the top of your ship probably doesn't do much unless it hits something important. That's always a possibility. But a hole underneath the ship does a lot more damage. So what's the point of all this? Well, the Germans invest heavily in submarines for two reasons. Number one, submarines can sneak by the British. The British have ships on the surface of the ocean. The submarines can sneak by them. And there's really no way to detect them in World War I. See them. They have to come up for air every few hours, but that's about it. Pretty hard. The ocean's a big place. Finding a German submarine when it comes up is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult to do. The second thing about U-boats that's really convenient is they're cheap. I mean, not cheap for you. You can't go buy one or finance one. We're still talking about millions of dollars of equipment here. But compared to a battleship, which could take upwards of 5 years to build and was more expensive than basically anything else you could produce, U-boats were a lot cheaper. And you could probably build 10 to 50 U-boats if you were careful about it for every one battleship you could create. And remember that effectively all you needed to do was hit that battleship with 1 or 2 torpedoes and it would go down. And you can see why the Germans thought the submarines might be the solution to their problems. Now, there ends up being some problems with the U-boats that are weren't exactly foreseen. Number one, U-boat technology in World War I is not that good. It is really unpleasant to be on these trips. It's really hard to go long distances. It's really hard to target your enemies. I mean, you're basically firing blind. They can't see you. You can't see them. You're just hoping that you're firing in the right direction and maybe there will be an impact. So submarines aren't really as effective as they could be against enemy warships. But what they are really effective against is enemy shipping. And that's exactly what the Germans were using it for. When they would see a ship with war material bound for Britain carrying ammunition and things like that, what they would do is they would come up and they would surface and they would announce, hey, we are going to blow you up. Get off your ship. So they would surface. They would yell over the ship, hey, we're about to blow you up. Get in your lifeboats, because if you're not in your lifeboats in 5 minutes, you're going to go down with your ship. So then everybody would get off. Boom, they blow up the ship with the torpedoes. They'd actually sit on the surface and line the torpedoes up. So the problem with that is obviously they can't do that to a warship. They come up to the surface and say, hey, surrender, they get shot and they die. So with a warship, they can't do that. They fire underneath the water and they try and blow the warship up. The British got really smart about this, and they started painting their boats, their ships, their warships like civilian vessels. So the Germans would surface to order this tanker to surrender and get on its lifeboats, and it actually turned out to be a British destroyer, and they blast them. So this caused the Germans, in response to this, to stop issuing warnings, period. The Germans would surface, target the vessel, go back down, blow it up. They wouldn't make any announcements, and the Lusitania, unfortunately, fell victim to this. It was painted just like a normal cruise liner, but remember, the British had already been using ships painted like cruise liners to blow German subs up. So the submarine pilot saw that this ship was painted like a cruise liner, went down, he couldn't tell if it had guns or not, and he shot it, and Lusitania went down with more than 1,000 people on it, including 120 Americans, approximately 120 Americans. We're not exactly sure, but close to that. Now, it's important to point out that the Lusitania was also carrying weapons, which really made the ship not neutral. The claim immediately from the British is that the Germans just blew up a completely neutral ship. This wasn't even war material. You couldn't even claim that this was for the war. But the reality was, and both the Germans, Americans, and English knew this, is that the Lusitania was carrying weapons and actually even had a couple soldiers on it that were being transferred around. So this was not entirely truthful on the British part, but still 120 Americans went down with the ship. And this was obviously not popular in the United States, as you, I'm sure, would be able to guess. Now, the next event that's really going to lead to the United States growing frustrated, and these events, remember, are happening in sequence, and the public opinion of Germany is going down in the United States, is the Zimmermann telegram. And it's going to happen 2 years after the Lusitania goes down. So Lusitania goes down in 1915. The United States tells Germany to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. That's blowing up ships without telling people to surrender. And Germany decides, okay, we will, because we don't want to accidentally kill any more Americans. So the Germans basically, they didn't start surfacing and telling people to surrender. They just only blew up ships that they were positive were military ships. So they killed a lot less ships because of this. But they also didn't anger the United States. In 1917, however, another incident occurs, and this is called the Zimmermann telegram. It's named the Zimmermann telegram for the name of the German minister who sent it, and he sent the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico. And effectively what the telegram said is that in the case of the United States entering the war, Germany wanted to know what the possibility of Mexico entering the war on the German side would be. So effectively, if the United States went to war, Mexico would join the war against the United States. Why would Germany want this? Well, effectively what it was to distract the United States. Now, the telegram promised that Mexico could have the territory that had once belonged to Mexico. So that would include Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and Utah. Basically, what Germany was doing, it was promising pieces that used to belong to Mexico for Mexican help. Now, let's break this down. Number one, this was a telegraph that was just basically probing the possibility. This was not a formal alliance. Mexico did not plan to jump the United States. That is sometimes misapplied to this. That's not what was going on. And let's also be honest about German intentions here. No one in their right mind thought Mexico could take the United States. It wouldn't have been close. The battle would have taken approximately 6 months, and it would have led to complete Mexican defeat. So Mexico never was going to take this deal. They weren't dumb. No one was that dumb. But think about it, what it might have done from a German perspective. By bringing Mexico into the war, if they were so foolish as to join it, they would distract the United States for 6 months. And that 6 months might be all that was necessary for Germany to win the war, and so it might have proven effective. Here's the problem. The problem is that this telegraph is actually intercepted by the British. The British are listening for communications. They receive this one, and they decode it, they translate it, and they send it to President Woodrow Wilson. The American government is obviously outraged by this basically blatant attempt to bring a power into war on the United States. Now, I remember that it was conditional. If the United States went to war, Mexico would declare war. So it didn't say Mexico declare war right now, but still, this is pretty insulting that the Germans were willing to tell another country to declare war on us, especially when technically the Germans had been saying, "Oh, America, we're still friends. You should stay out of the war because we actually are very similar to you. We have your best interests at heart." And clearly, this was not true because they had wanted someone to declare war on them. Now, that didn't even get the United States into war. Everybody's like, "Oh, this is it, right? This has got to be the final straw, the last straw. The United States has got to be in the war now." Nope, it's not in the war. The American public are frustrated, but at the same time, there wasn't actually any real threat to join. I mean, they said if the United States joins the war, the United States wasn't joining the war, right? In fact, President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned for the 1916 election on a policy that we will not join the war. So the United States was still kind of stuck. This was bad evidence against Germany, but not really anything that could be done as far as American entry into the war. Well, finally, Germany does actually break the camel's back and brings the United States into the war. Germany decides to reopen the unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, why did Germany do this? Well, the answer to that question is simple. The Germans had smelled the blood in the water, if you will, about Russia. Now, if you know anything about Russia during World War I, it has something called the Communist Revolution, which we will actually go back and talk about after this next test because it's super important and it leads to the rise of the United States' largest military and political rival in the 20th century, the Soviet Union. So super important. But in early 1917, we have the beginning of the Communist Revolution in Russia. Now, it's going to take until October for the communists to really start to take control, but Russia is politically destabilized. Their armies are disorganized, and Germany senses that it will probably be able to knock Russia out of the war in 1917. By the way, that is true. Russia signs a ceasefire with Germany in November, and it actually signs a peace treaty with the Germans in the beginning of 1918. So the Germans sense that the Russian half of the conflict is going to be over. And remember what we talked about at the very beginning. Germany has been engaged in a two-front war. This means that half of its resources had been tied up in Russia, but now it is looking at the possibility of being able to take those armies and send them against the West. And the West has been even with half of Germany's forces in play. What happens when you double the amount of Germans? Clearly, the West is going to be very, very hard-pressed to hold the Germans off. To add to this pressure, and by the way, France and Great Britain knew that Russia was weak and would likely fall soon. To add to this pressure, the Germans decided to start blowing up British ships. What they were really hoping to do was when Russia surrendered, France and Britain would give up. Not surrender, but say, look, we're tired of fighting. We're just going to end the war. Germany, let's go to the negotiating table and end the war. Because that's the goal. Germany didn't really intend to conquer France. It didn't intend to conquer Great Britain, at least not at that time. It didn't have the resources to do so. But if it could get them to quit the war, then effectively it would have won. And so in 1917, in March, the Germans began unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning there are no warnings. There is no limit on what the Germans will blow up. Cruise liners, cargo ships, fishing vessels, warships, they're going to blow anything up that they can see. And of course, this action is guaranteed going to kill Americans, and almost undoubtedly the Americans will join the war. And the Germans are comfortable with this. On April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson, stating the unrestricted warfare of the German submarines, asks Congress to declare war on the Empire of Germany. And he also eventually later sees a declaration of war from Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. So eventually the United States is at war with all of the Central Powers, although American troops really never see combat in anywhere but the Western Front against Germany. So we were technically at war with the rest, but we're not really going to fight against them. Now, why would Germany do this? It was almost guaranteed that the United States would have to join the war at this point. After these four things, the attack on Belgium, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmerman's telegram, and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, everybody knew the United States was going to have to join the war. Why would Germany do this? Well, Germany did not believe the United States could mobilize fast enough to make a difference. And that's really key, Because April 6, 1917, the United States had a 100,000 man army. The British and Germans combined had lost 100,000 men in one day at the Battle of Verdun. One day. So the American army is basically worthless. Zero. Sure, they've got a navy, but the British already had the German navy bottled up. So the American navy is really just adding strength to strength. There's nothing that they can do. It's not like you can pick a battleship up and carry it over land. It can't win the battle in the trenches. So the United States is going to have to mobilize its troops. They're going to be green and fresh, and compared to the veteran German and British and French troops, it's going to take them years to get good enough to drive the Germans back. So the Germans thought effectively, look, America isn't even going to get in the war. We're going to beat down the British and the French so fast that they're going to surrender. And once they've surrendered, why is the United States even going to fight? It's not going to. It's going to give up. That was the plan. The problem is that the Germans miscalculated on two things. Number one, the Russians died a little bit slower than they were expected to. The Germans thought they would be totally out of Russia by the fall of 1917. Instead, they weren't out to the spring of 1918. Secondly, the United States did something very clever. They asked the French and the British to supply them with weapons. So all the Americans really had to do was find soldiers. And of course, the United States was one of the most populous nations on earth. And so very quickly, the Western allies were being reinforced by the Americans, not with American-made equipment, but with British and French equipment, which is something that many people don't realize. Tanks, guns, even airplanes, many of those were actually from Great Britain and from France being used by Americans. So by the spring of 1918, which is when real combat occurs between the Americans and the Germans, there were many more Americans in Europe than the Germans had ever expected there to be. And the Germans were 6 months behind. Because of these two things, the Americans and Germans are going to end up facing off. And we're not going to explore that in the very next lecture. We're going to explore that in the final lecture for this week, where we talk about American combat in Europe. That's all I have for you guys today. Remember to fill out the worksheet that has questions based on this lecture. Again, they're really just to check if you've been paying attention. There might be one essay length one just to give some feedback thoughts on what you think about this whole thing of the United States entering the war. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully you've learned something. We'll pick up with the story of the entire war in the next lecture.